As Americans, we're taught to follow our hearts. I suppose that this sentiment has been the basis for all kinds of commencement speeches that have gone on over the last couple of weeks, telling young people as they embark upon life, adulthood, to follow their hearts. There's a lot of different ways in which this message is communicated in our culture. It is a cultural narrative, to be sure. It comes up in a variety of ways, in all kinds of different forums. We're taught to be guided by our feelings. Our emotions instruct us in what we most need, that our hearts will tell us what we most need, and we will never be led wrong. Our hearts will always tell us the truth. Regardless of what we've been taught or what other people think of us, we should always just follow our hearts. I don't know when exactly this philosophy captured American society, but it's been around for a long time. And I would, just to put a marker out in terms of when this philosophy began to become prominent, I would suggest that we look to the post-World War II era. There are cultural shifts that took place following World War II. There's a generation of people who lived through two wars and the Great Depression, saw a great deal of loss, death, hardship, suffering. Following World War II, in this country at least, that all began to change, and people finally began to know peace and prosperity. And there was a generation that could now have a better life and could begin to hope that their children could even have a better life than them. And I would suggest to you that this notion of following your heart became very much a part of the fixture of American life, American culture, post-World War II. I wrote about this last week to give you an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, how this philosophy has pervaded culture. As an example, you can think of the 1965 film, the musical Sound of Music. Sound of Music. Do you remember? I've seen The Sound of Music, I could admit it. It's a fine movie, I guess. But, you know, Maria, Julie Andrews' character, Maria, she's leaving the convent. She's going to break her vows. And she sings the song, "Climb every mountain. Climb every mountain, ford every stream. Follow every rainbow till you find your dream." 1965. And you know what a movie that was. Maybe a more modern example, though, a more modern example of this philosophy being promoted in culture, at least through pop culture. In 2013, an animated Disney movie, Frozen. I know I've at least slept through that movie, but it's a very popular movie, very popular character, Elsa. And she's the main character, and she's tired. She's tired of living up to everyone's expectations. She's tired of concealing who she truly is. And in the theme song to that film, Let It Go, she's going to let it go. Let it go, turn away, slam the door. I don't care what they're going to say. It's time to see what I can do. Test the limits and break through. No right, no wrong, no rules for me. I'm free. And wow, you know, kids love that movie. I grew up on Disney. I'm not trying to knock Disney movies, and I don't know how influential Disney movies are on shaping the minds of children. I know that they're influential. But what I'm showing to you, what I'm trying to illustrate to you, is how this notion of follow your heart is permeated our society. And quite frankly, the generation in 1965 would have never imagined the culture of 2023 America. The seeds of follow your heart were sown in that baby boomer generation, and they've grown full in their grandchildren. Today the seeds of this philosophy are destroying us, absolutely destroying us. We're reaping a harvest of brokenness, a harvest of division, a harvest of discord. There's breakdown, absolute breakdown within nearly every facet of society, because this philosophy of follow your heart leads to the breakdown of society. It leads to the breakdown of rules, norms, order. You think about the kind of brokenness that pervades our society, the family. The family has been redefined. You think of the nuclear family back in 1965. My, oh my, how the image of that family has changed drastically to 2023. Homosexuality has been normalized. Gender is being redefined. Religious affiliation, you probably saw some recent research that came out, I think last week or the week before, about religious affiliation continues to be in a downward spiral. Technology, in spite of the advances in the good things that it has done for us, has continued to produce isolation and loneliness, depression, anxiety rapidly increasing. Mass shootings have become an absolute way of life. Teenage suicide is at an all-time high and only seems to be increasing. And no one knows what to do about it. All of the problems that I just described, if we would even characterize them as problems, some would say it's progress. What's the cause of all of that? It is quite something when you watch the news and they're reporting a story that is disturbing even to the reporters, and they start asking the questions, well, why? Why is this normal? Why is this going on? What can we do to solve these problems? And no one seems to have any answers. No one seems to have any solutions. What's the cause of this mess? Is the societal mess the fault of happy homes? Are happy homes to blame? It's the hardworking fathers. It's the fault of the hardworking fathers and the homemaking mothers. They're to blame for society's problems. Schools? It's the school's fault. Trying to teach character, trying to instill uniformity and discipline among staff and students. Are they to blame? Oh, it's the church's fault. It's the church's fault, preaching against sin and preaching the exclusive path to salvation through Jesus. It's the church's fault for the mess, right? No, not hardly. Not hardly. The culprit for the problems of our society are the devil. The devil is ultimately to blame for the breakdown, for the distortion. We have an adversary that tells us that everything is good, everything is just, everything is holy. He seeks our demise by telling us lies. He deceives, he distorts. He deceives the human heart, and it's as old as the Garden of Eden. As he distorts the truth, he persuades people that he's not real. Some would laugh, scoff at my claim that the devil is the problem. He says that sin isn't really sin. Sin's good. Sin's satisfying. Sin will fix you. It'll fix the problems. When he convinces us to obey him, then he's got us. The devil has effectively deceived millions upon millions. that they can have everything they need, everything they want, if they just follow their hearts. I mean, it sounds innocent, doesn't it? It sounds pure, doesn't it? It sounds good. I mean, wouldn't you want to communicate a message like this to a group of high school graduates as they embark on their lives? Follow your heart. What's wrong with that? We need to be warned about the danger of this delusion. So consider some of what the Bible has to say warning us about this danger. First of all, following your own heart is idolatry. Following your own heart is idolatry. The nation of Israel, they were chosen by God to be the light of the world. Over time, though, they rejected God. They rejected God. They removed Him from their families. They removed Him from their civic life. They removed Him from their spirituality. And in His place, they sought their identity through idols. Idols that were the product of their hearts. Our worship is simply a reflection of who and what is in our heart. In Judges 21, there's an interesting statement that's made. This is a sad conclusion to the book. That in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now you have to stop and think about this statement a little bit for this reason. This was the period of Judges. There wasn't a king in Israel. The kings, the period of kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, they came later. So what does the text mean that there was no king? Well, of course there wasn't a king in Israel. Not a king in terms of how we might be thinking in terms of a civic leader, but the fact of the matter was there was always a king in Israel. His name was Jehovah. He was their king. He was their ruler. He was their Savior, their protector, defender, and redeemer. And in this period of history that we refer to as the period of Judges, generationally, they would reject their king and turn to idols and reap devastating consequences as a result. Time and time again. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That is the philosophy of follow your heart. Now we can look historically, as we did in the introduction, and try to analyze where this philosophy really gains prominence in our society. But it's not new. Again, as Americans, we think that we're new, that we're progressive, that we're advanced, that we found a way to a better life is to follow your heart. And there's nothing new about it at all. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And it caused devastation in Israel. And Israel struggled. They struggled generationally to learn from the mistakes of earlier generations. And they just kept on repeating this vicious cycle. Now, many today, rather than serve God, they just want to do what's right in their own eyes. I get to determine what is right and what is wrong. Not you. Not anyone else. Just me. Well, when everyone starts to live like that, there's going to be disorder. There's going to be chaos. There's going to be pain. There's going to be breakdown. Sin produces decay, which culminates in death, as we have said over and over again in our study of Romans. This breakdown of truth that pervades our society today doesn't stem from God. It doesn't stem from God or the institutions that He established. It's not the fault of the home. It's not the fault of marriage. It's not the fault of the church. They're not the problem. They're good because they've come from God. If there is a solution, and I believe there is, then God, His Word, His Son, and His church are very much part of the solution. I preached about that several weeks ago in terms of the truth being, or the church being the pillar and ground of the truth. But if we're going to disregard God and just follow our hearts, then we've become nothing more than idolaters. Lastly, here in 1 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 21, in the aftermath of Israel demanding a king, they got what they wanted. But Samuel prays on their behalf. And his prayer is as much a warning as anything. He says, "Do not turn aside after empty things that cannot profit or deliver, for they are empty." The idols that we serve are empty things. They do not profit and they cannot deliver. They cannot deliver. We're just going to try to follow our hearts, follow the rainbows, following our dreams, whatever our dreams are, wherever they might lead. We're bound to be disappointed. We're bound to be disappointed. We could talk about numbers of examples of people who've tried to follow their hearts. And if you look behind them, there is a wake of wreckage and destruction as they have tried to follow their hearts. People blow up their families because they want to follow their hearts. Because the heart wants what the heart wants. I was reading about someone just the other day who had fame and fortune, a successful career, married to a professional athlete, but she divorced him. And the quote was, the reason for her divorcing her husband was that she wasn't making choices that were conducive for her following her aspirations, her hopes, and her dreams. Again, I say, if achieving your dreams involves you making a wreck of your marriage and your family, you need to reevaluate what you're dreaming for. You need to stop and consider, what's going on in my heart? What's going on in my heart? In James chapter 4, I don't have the text on the screen here, but James asks, what causes quarrels and causes fights among you? And James is talking about some problems in this church, but if we just think about problems and fighting generally, there's a lot of it that's going on in our society. He says, is this not that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask, and you do not ask and you do not receive because you ask wrongly, to spend it on your passions. There is a war going on within us, within our hearts. And there is a means by which that war can be conquered, can be won, while the heart can be trained. But if we're not going to engage in that process and we're just going to follow our hearts, we'll never be satisfied. He says you covet, but you can't get what you want because it's never good enough. It's never good enough. Sin cannot be profited from. It doesn't deliver on its promise. It can't satisfy. It's not going to fix you. It's not going to make you happy. Idols are there to destroy us, to serve the purposes of the devil. So be careful about just following your heart. Rather than following your heart, you need to follow your God. Now, there's a message that probably hasn't been spoken very much at commencement ceremonies. I'm going to give some guidance and direction to young people. Don't follow your heart, follow your God. Why? Why should I follow my God? Because He made you. Your God made you. Let that sink in. He made you. He knows you through and through. He knows you better than you know yourself. He knows you better than you can know yourself. Read Romans 8 as we talked about this morning. So follow Him. The Bible warns against following our hearts in the place of God. In the days of Jeremiah, Israel had completely rejected God and destruction was coming. They were going to be punished. And in Jeremiah chapter 11, he's saying how the problems in Israel were just repeating themselves. They were dealing with this, going through the same mess that earlier generations went through. In verse 4, he says, "So shall you be my people, and I will be your God." Yet they did not obey or incline their ear, but everyone walked in the stubbornness of his evil heart. Jeremiah is begging. He is begging and pleading with Israel to repent, to return to their God, to give up their idols, and to return to their Maker. But they don't incline their ear. They don't listen. Why? Because of the stubbornness of their evil heart. It wasn't just that the heart had become evil, but it had become hardened. It had become hardened to the message of salvation. Yeah, Jeremiah was communicating a message of salvation to the people. Stubbornness, they didn't want to hear. They tried to kill Jeremiah. Israel had produced so much immorality and injustice among themselves that God was now pouring out His cup of wrath upon them. Well, if I can learn from them, I could see very clearly that that's not a good end. It's not wise. It's not wise to walk in the stubbornness of my evil heart. Pride is not going to produce a favorable result. God wants us to follow Him. He wants us to follow Him. In this 23rd Psalm, as famous and familiar as it is, how many live according to the 23rd Psalm? "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." That's very different from James 4, isn't it? James says, "You're warring in your passions. You have longings and desires, but you're not being satisfied. Because you're not seeking to satisfy them with the right things." If the Lord is my shepherd, I'm going to be satisfied. I'm going to be fulfilled. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for His name's sake. That sounds like a pretty good life. That sounds like a hopeful life, a life of peace and security. A life of blessedness. Jesus talks about blessedness. He wants to give us blessedness, but He asks that we follow Him. The Lord is my shepherd. It's a very interesting analogy that's given to us. The shepherds, they would call the sheep by name. The identity of the sheep was given by the shepherd. But so many people today are trying to find their identity according to their heart. Their heart tells you who your true, authentic self is. And despite what everyone else thinks and what everyone's telling you, you just need to let it go so you can stop concealing who you truly are. And we start off down that road, never find what we're looking for. We'll find what we need if we follow our God. So bring your heart to the God who built your heart. Bring your heart to the God who made your heart. When God isn't present in our hearts, they're going to become corrupt. They're going to be distorted, deceived, hardened over the course of time without intervention. In Jeremiah 17 and verses 9 and 10, he says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it?" There's plenty of evidence for this, isn't there? There's plenty of evidence for this. Desperately sick, and who can understand it? So what can we do? If that's the condition of the heart, then what can be done? I mean, it sounds rather hopeless, doesn't it? I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind. We have to allow God in so that He can fill the heart, so that He can reshape the heart, so that He can make the heart beat and give it life. the life that it's yearning for. The maker of our hearts knows us better than we do. There was a time in David's life, when he followed his heart. Do you remember? He followed his heart, wrecked his life, ruined his kingdom. He looked upon a woman. He saw something he shouldn't have seen, and rather than turn away and go back into his house, now he fixed his heart on this woman. And he asked his servants, "You go bring this woman to me." David was a powerful man. He could have whatever his heart wanted. Bathsheba was brought to him. He committed adultery with her. And he thought everything was all right, thought everything was concealed and put away, and then he received word that she was pregnant. And now there's a problem because her husband, one of David's mighty men of valor, incidentally, who'd risked his life time and again for David in those early days when he was on the run from Saul. Uriah was out fighting. There's no way possible for Bathsheba to be pregnant. Her husband's been off at war. And now it's not lust that's consuming David's heart, but it's fear. It's fear that consumes his heart. And fear consuming the heart is just as disastrous as lust consuming the heart. And out of fear now he's got to cover his tracks. And he conspires murder of his mighty man of valor, Uriah the Hittite. And then eventually it all comes to light. It all comes to light, and he began to bear the consequences of what he had done. Thankfully, though, he came to his senses. He came to his senses. In the 51st Psalm, he pours out his heart in confessing his sin to his God, and he begged, "God, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." What we see in this text is the kind of attitude that we need to develop. We need to look to God to create a clean heart in us, a new heart in us. And that's always what He is intended to do. If you continue over in Jeremiah, that's the promise that is made in Jeremiah, that God is going to create a new heart in Israel. He creates a new heart, offers to create a new heart within us through the Messiah and by the Spirit. He'll rebuild us, remake us, renew us, and restore us. This work of renewal requires our faithful commitment to properly defining our desires according to His will. Rather than impulsively seeking self-gratification, our hearts must become instruments to God's glory. So on the surface, the philosophy of follow your heart sounds promising and hopeful. But that's the problem with the philosophy. It's superficial. If we dig down deep, though, what we find is that it's deceitful and cannot fulfill what it promises. Our hearts cannot be filled or made content through lust and pride. No amount of wrong, sex, possessions, money, status, power, none of that's going to fix our hearts. None of it's going to bring peace and contentment. What we need is the Creator. We need the Savior. And we need the Spirit. So, as the Proverbs instruct us, we need to keep our hearts with vigilance. For from the heart flows all the issues of life. Thank you for your attention tonight. I hope that we will not just look into our hearts, but that we will bring God and His Word as we look into our hearts and seek to share in God's process of renewal and transformation If in taking the gospel in one hand, you look into your heart tonight and your heart's not right, if it's not right, then look to God to change it, to renew it, to recreate it. He's willing and able to do that through His Son, if you'd believe and obey Him. If we can help you in that tonight, please come forward as together we stand and sing.